You have been broken before. That is not an assumption. It is simply what happens to people who feel things deeply and expect the world to meet them with the same honesty they bring to it. What is less discussed is what came after. The rebuilding, the quiet restructuring of how you carried yourself, how much you revealed, how carefully you began to move through spaces that once felt safe. Most people call that healing, and perhaps it was, but there is a version of recovery that is not healing at all. It is architecture. It is the careful construction of a self that looks whole from the outside, that functions, that even thrives, while somewhere beneath all of it, the original fracture remains exactly where it was, untouched, simply no longer visible. There is a difference between someone who is healed and someone who has learned, with great precision, to not show where they still break. Most people believe they broke because something happened to them. A relationship, a failure, a loss, a pressure that arrived too suddenly and with too much force. And there is a kind of comfort in that reading. It places the cause outside, makes the collapse feel like an act of nature rather than an act of erosion. But if you stay still long enough and look honestly enough at the sequence of events that led to that moment, a different picture begins to form, not of impact, but of structure, and structure, unlike events, can be studied. The human psyche is not fragile in the way we tend to assume. It does not shatter easily. It bends, absorbs, compensates, reroutes. It is remarkably capable of functioning under weight. So capable, in fact, that it can continue to function long after the weight has become unsustainable. This is precisely where the danger lives. Not in the obvious strains, but in the invisible ones. The compromises made in silence. The boundaries quietly revised downward. The parts of identity quietly set aside because maintaining them required energy that was needed elsewhere. None of these feel significant in isolation. Cumulatively, they are the architecture of collapse itself. What this means is that the thing that finally broke you, whatever form it took, was rarely the cause. It was simply the last addition to a structure that had already been compromised for longer than you realized. The breaking point is visible. The preceding erosion is not. And so the mind, searching for explanation, fixes on the visible. It mistakes the final weight for the whole story. It gives the last event the significance that actually belongs to the long silence before it. There is a more difficult truth embedded here, and it concerns the nature of identity. Not identity as feeling, not who you believe yourself to be in moments of confidence or clarity, but identity as structure, as something load-bearing. The self, in this sense, is not simply an inner life. It is a system of tolerances, commitments, and internal agreements that either hold under pressure or do not. And like any structure, it requires maintenance, not dramatic reconstruction. Maintenance, the daily, unglamorous act of knowing what you are made of and refusing to compromise it in increments so small they seem inconsequential. What most people never confront is that they were not ambushed. They were already thinning. Whatever arrived at the end found them in a state they had been quietly entering for some time, and they had not named it, had not measured it, had not acknowledged to themselves how far the erosion had progressed. This is not an accusation. It is the most honest account of how human collapse typically unfolds. It is structural, it is slow, and it is almost always preceded by a long period of quiet internal compromise that the person never officially registered as dangerous. The collapse was not the beginning of the problem. It was the end of a process you were already inside. Lesson 02: What you allowed to hold authority over you. Breaking is rarely caused by external force alone. This is the part people resist most, not because it is false, but because it complicates a story that felt clean. The world did something. You suffered. That sequence is real, but running parallel to it almost always is a quieter sequence, one that began before the event, sometimes long before it. A slow accumulation of small transfers, a look that made you revise yourself, a silence that you filled with your worst assumption and then treated as fact, an outcome you needed so completely that its absence didn't just disappoint you, it reorganized you. What happens in those moments is not weakness in the ordinary sense. It is something more structural. Authority is being assigned, not claimed by force from outside, but extended from within, granted unconsciously to something that now carries the power to define whether you are enough, whether you are safe, whether what you are doing means anything at all. The difficulty is that these transfers rarely feel like decisions. They feel like perception. They feel like simply seeing things clearly, recognizing your value through the confirmation of someone whose opinion you respected, or measuring your progress through an outcome you had made too sacred. This is where the quiet violence lives, not in the external thing itself, but in the architecture you built around it. The dependency becomes load-bearing before you ever notice it was there. And when the thing it was built around disappears, the person, the validation, the result, what collapses is not just a circumstance. What collapses is a structure of self that was never designed to stand on its own because it was never asked to. The external source was always meant to finish the sentence, and now the sentence has no ending. Understanding this with precision matters, not as self-indictment, but as cartography. You cannot navigate out of a territory you refuse to map accurately. The person who granted authority to an opinion did not do so out of stupidity. They did so because authority feels like it belongs somewhere, and we are pattern-seeking creatures in a world that offers no instruction manual for where to place it. The locus of control, that internal axis around which a life can actually stabilize, is not something most people are ever taught to locate, let alone defend. So it drifts, and things fill the space it left. What changes when this is seen clearly is not the past. The past stays exactly where it is. What changes is the mechanism. You begin to notice in real time when something is being handed weight it hasn't earned, when an outcome is being elevated into a verdict, when a person's withdrawal is being experienced as proof of something permanent about your worth. The noticing itself is not the same as reclamation, but it is the necessary condition for it. Sovereignty does not announce itself. It does not arrive as confidence or as calm. It arrives quietly, as a refusal to let the sentence be finished by anything outside the self. And once you feel that refusal, really feel it, beneath the noise, you realize it was always available. You simply hadn't held on to it long enough to know it was yours. What most people call the self is actually a negotiation. It is an ongoing agreement between who you are and what your environment will allow. You learn early which parts of yourself are welcome and which must be managed. You develop language, manner, posture, a whole architecture of presentation, and over time that architecture begins to feel like you. It becomes indistinguishable from you. And then something collapses. A loss, a failure, a relationship that undoes years of careful self-construction, and the architecture doesn't hold. This is the moment most people interpret as destruction. What they rarely consider is that it might be excavation. Pressure does not create identity. It removes what was always temporary. the personality forged in comfort, the confidence that existed because conditions supported it, the steadiness that never faced real weight. These are not the self. They are the self's attempt to survive a world that required a particular shape. When that shape is broken, what remains is harder to name but impossible to deny. It is not resilience in the way the word is usually used, not a skill you can develop on a Tuesday afternoon. It is something closer to bedrock, a layer of existence that was always beneath the construction, waiting without urgency, indifferent to whether it was ever acknowledged. The difficulty, and this is worth sitting with, is that the version of yourself you were trying to protect may not deserve protection. Some identities were built for a world that no longer exists. Some versions of the self were held together by conditions, a relationship, a title, an image. Others reflected back, and when those conditions dissolve, the identity dissolves with them. This is not a failure of character. It is a structural revelation. What was built on borrowed stability was always going to require those loans to survive. The self that emerges from genuine collapse is not a rebuilt version of what came before. It is something that had no interest in the previous structure to begin with. The Stoics understood something about this that modern thinking has largely softened. They were not interested in resilience as recovery. They were interested in the interior that required no recovery, the part of a person that pressure cannot reach because it was never constructed from the materials pressure can destroy. This is not detachment, and it is not indifference. It is a kind of rootedness so complete that circumstances become information rather than threat. The person who has found this layer doesn't become immune to difficulty. They become differently oriented to it. Something in them stops requiring the world to cooperate in order to remain coherent. The most durable form of protection a person can develop is not strength in the conventional sense. It is not aggression, not withdrawal, not the performance of indifference. It is a cultivated internal stillness, one that gives nothing away and requires nothing in return. This kind of silence is not built overnight. It emerges slowly, usually after a person has experienced what happens when they were too open, too soon, in the wrong room, with the wrong people. What they learn, not as a philosophy, but as lived understanding, is that not everything felt needs to be spoken, not everything valued needs to be displayed, and not everything needed must be announced. The person who has absorbed this truth becomes, in a precise sense, unbreakable, because there is simply less surface area for the world to grip. What separates this from emotional suppression is difficult to articulate, but important to understand. Suppression contracts. It stores what cannot be expressed and accumulates pressure beneath the surface. Sovereign silence does the opposite. It expands quietly, steadily, because it is not hiding something wounded. It is protecting something whole. The person practicing suppression is afraid of what they feel. The person practicing interior silence has simply decided that certain rooms are not the right context for certain truths. That is not fear, that is discernment. And discernment at its most refined begins to look almost indistinguishable from mastery. There is a psychology to the unreadable person that is often misinterpreted. They are assumed to be calculating, withholding as a form of manipulation, using mystery as leverage. But genuine interior silence has no such agenda. It doesn't perform mystery, it simply doesn't perform. The unreadable person is not managing your perception of them. They have stopped needing to. What you see, or more accurately, what you cannot see, is not strategy. It is the natural expression of someone who has fully arrived inside themselves and no longer requires external confirmation to know where they stand. Emotional openness, as a default setting, is often praised as maturity or courage. And in the right environment, it is. But there are environments and relationships that have historically proven unsafe, where openness was met with exploitation, where vulnerability was cataloged and eventually used. In those contexts, the movement towards selective interiority is not regression, it is evolution. The person who learns to govern what they reveal and when and to whom has not become closed. They have become careful in the precise, technical sense of the word, full of care for what is genuinely worth protecting.